Well, good morning. It is so good to have you all here and to see you. And if some of you are guests from Christmas or whenever, it is a delight to have you as well. I love this service. This time of year, right, there's kind of this weird service that happens like between Christmas and New Year's. But I love kind of just having us all in the room and because I kind of get to do something different usually in this. And that's what I'm going to do this morning as well. This is like not a normal kind of sermon or morning. I'll just like warn you about that up front on this thing, but that's okay. I'm not going to teach a passage of scripture, maybe the way I normally would, but there's some scripture that we're going to look in this, and everything I'm going to talk about is really based out of scripture. Because here's what I want to talk about. I'll tell you what I want to talk about, and then tell you kind of how this started. I want to talk about values, and I want to talk about, in particular, your own personal values and how they affect and shape your life. Because this is an area of passion of mine that I think is really important. And it was interesting this past, October, I think. I went over to Central Asia with one of our teams and was working with a number of pastors over there. And got into this one discussion with a pastor who is an amazing leader. He is in an area where the number of Christians probably represent less than 1% of the population, okay? And so you can imagine some of the challenges and stuff that he would have. And so one evening after we had finished a bunch of stuff and we had our third dinner and 20th cup of tea and just a whole cultural thing. He said, I want to talk to you about a strategy that we're working on. And I said, I'm struggling with this. And the government had just that year changed some of the laws regarding religion in the country, specifically trying to push out kind of radical or fringe groups of which they didn't fit into in any way. Everyone knew that. But the new regulations and issues were really causing problems, especially for like small churches, which all the churches in this area are like tiny. I mean, we're talking about less than 1% of the population. And it meant that these churches were going to have to come together and they were going to have to do some registering together and they were going to have to share resources, all these different things. And he says, I work on these strategies. And he was kind of the catalyst for all these different pastors. And he says, but like we start working out these really good plans and then we start going opposite directions and it kind of all falls apart. And I keep coming back to this strategy and it all falls apart and everyone kind of goes their own direction. And you can imagine it's because things are changing a little bit and it's creating some tension. And what everyone wanted to do, all the different church leaders and church whatever, is just kind of hunker down. Like, okay, just like things are getting hard or there's these unexpected difficulties. I just want to hunker down, But they couldn't come together. And as we started to have this conversation, I just asked him this question. I just said, so with the plans that you've got, what are the driving values behind these plans that you're putting before it? And he said, tell me more about this. Like, what do you mean about these driving values or whatever? And I said, well, I just know that like where I'm from, we have the same kinds of problems. Like we can get divided and scattered and all these different things. And I said, a really wise mentor and leader that I had years ago, he kept pulling me back to always laying these concrete foundational values, whatever it was that we were seeking or trying to do. And do I need to do anything different with my mic? Okay, all right. And so we got into this dialogue, this discussion, and I literally walked him through all the values that we hold as a church and why, and we didn't end until well after 1 o'clock in the morning, okay? But he told me afterwards, he said, this was such a gift because he said, I see how these strategies, and he's an incredible leader. I can learn much from him. But the gift was, he realized that is I can help lay these like bedrock values down under will help with just the strategies and things that we need in order to actually unify and move together in all of this. And so in a way, what I want to do here this morning is just have a similar kind of discussion with you all about values, because it's not just for churches, right? Think about this. You think there's any chance you're going to run into an unexpected problem or difficulty in this next year? Yeah, of course you are. The fact, the one thing you can expect is that there's going to be some unexpected problems and difficulties this year. And so often what I watch is that when we run into these unexpected problems or difficulties, it's easy to like start back from scratch and feel like, oh my gosh, this unexpected, unforeseen thing. And now we're scrambling, trying to figure out something, building it from ground up. But what if your starting point wasn't at like the ground level of trying to figure everything out? What if there was always a set of values that you could come back to? Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. Like the value of something's not working, just fix it. Just walk up on stage and fix it, right? There's a good value. So what I want to do this morning is just have a discussion around values. And like at one point we were talking about here's one example of how values work. A really simple example. One of our values as a church is being multi-generational. That we want to be deliberate about reaching multiple generations and continuing to move our church forward generation after generation after generation. That we don't want to just think about the here and now. And that has led us to do a lot of different things over the years. For instance, like at a strategy level, we're always thinking about, okay, how do we reach back and create space for the generation behind us, that younger generation? And we're always asking older generations in this church to make sacrifices to reach a younger generation. But we're also always wanting to point in a way that says, and how do we honor our older generations? Because we realize what they have invested in us as a church, see? And so, we had this great moment here not too long ago where we had a senior adult Christmas like luncheon. And the staff, without me asking, without like major plans working into this whole thing, they ended up, as they were working on this Christmas luncheon for some of our senior adults, they ended up inviting our high schoolers and our young adults, like college age, to actually participate in this and create this moment where we could actually put the same generations in the same room together just to get to know each other, even just in a casual way, just to get to value each other. And that's just like one little example of how a value actually gets you thinking about the tangible things you're doing in the moment that begin shaping it towards what matters most. And again, that's with the church. But all of us at an individual level have values. There are things, and to be able to identify and lean into those values will be a gift. You will give yourself a gift to be able to identify and understand your values. And then when that unexpected thing happens, to begin just leaning into what that means. Because I would imagine many of you're gonna face relational struggles in this coming year. There's gonna be financial struggles. There's gonna be struggles at work. There's gonna be medical struggles. There's gonna be all of these different things. But here's the beauty about values. They have a way of influencing and helping with any of those things that you face. They become a kind of filter or a compass that helps you move forward in this. So let me start off with this. Let me just define values. Let me give you kind of a working definition of values as we think about it. A value is something you hold as being supremely important about life and how you live it, okay? It's more than just a belief about something, but it is something that you hold just as being important enough that it will affect how you live. When people and organizations lean into their values, I promise you this, those values ooze out. You can begin to feel them and see them because values have a way of affecting all those different things. And so in your life, if there is a value that you start leaning into, it'll start oozing out of you in ways that maybe you don't even see at times, but probably in ways that you want. Just an exercise here to help you think about this and how values work a little bit. I want you to think of a place that you've worked, maybe in the past, okay? Maybe as a place you worked for a long time or a little while. And as you think about that place that you worked, what I want you to do for just a moment is forget the mission statement. If they had a mission statement that was written and put on the wall, I want you to just ignore that mission statement here for a moment, because a mission statement is different than your values. And lots of workplaces can have written mission statements that sound beautiful and wonderful and can be an absolute contradiction to the truth of what their values really are. So I want you to think about a place that you have worked someplace, okay? And I want to ask you this question about that. What mattered most at that place, okay? Was it quality? Was it profit? Was it people? Was it money? Was it integrity? What mattered most? When you think about that place you worked, what message did you get? Because probably that's the thing that was oozing out, and you're touching on what the real value was, or some of those values were that you worked. And you may think back on it, you may go, man, I hated working at that place. Well, maybe because there were values that were contradictory to your values. Or maybe you think back and you go, I loved that place, because maybe you shared some values with that place and you loved it, but I bet they oozed out. Another question. And think about this more as like with people. I want you to think of a teacher that you had that you just really loved. Just a teacher, just like, man, that was one of my favorite teachers. Maybe it was grade school, maybe it was a professor in college. And let me ask you like a similar question. What mattered most to that teacher, do you think? When you think about that teacher, what was it? Was it students? Was it a passion for learning? Maybe it was a specific topic. Just that teacher just loved math, and I never understood that, but man, he or they just loved math. Maybe it was fun. Maybe it was achievement. What was it that, when you think about that teacher, what mattered to them most in that classroom? That's probably what one of their personal values were that was oozing out. So one of my favorite teachers was a professor at Baylor University, and it was for physics. And if you know me at all, you're just like, Glenn, nothing about physics and Glenn goes together, right? Because there wasn't. I didn't like physics in high school. I didn't like physics in college, okay? But one of my favorite teachers was a physics teacher, okay? And the reason was, he had two values that he really had. One was he had a value for fun. The man just valued fun, okay? So wherever he went, it was going to be fun because that was one of his values. But he also had this great passion. He loved to see students learn something new that they didn't know before. So he was always challenged by can I get Barteau to learn something about physics? Because that sounds like a challenge. And if I could do that, that would just make him happy, okay? And so this just played out. It was funny, I learned after I had finished, his name was Dr. Packard, and after I finished his physics class, I learned that he had the opportunity to have worked at almost any place he wanted. That he had offers from the Defense Department, he had offers from NASA. This man could have been working for NASA for a lot more money, but he chose to be a teacher at a university teaching a beginnings physics class to guys like me who were Greek majors and could care less about math and physics and stuff. But like, why? Well, because he valued fun and he wanted to make it something that was real. I remember one time showing up to his class. I was walking up to the door, and this was like in a huge, I bet there was 200 or 300 students in a lecture hall for his class. Walking up, and he met every one of us at the door. This one day, he meets every one of us at the door. And he'd gather us up in like groups of 10. He goes, okay, now, shh. He goes, so Tony fell asleep in the last class, and we didn't wake him up. So I want you to sneak in there and don't wake him up. We're gonna start class and we're gonna just let him sleep. And he got like all 300 of us into that classroom, right? And then halfway through the class, right? And old Tony's there, you know, we had the desk that had like the little flip up desk thing, and he's like and we're like halfway through the class. And then Dr. Packard motions to the guy sitting next to Tony. He's like, okay, like, wake him up. And he wakes up and he's sitting there and he's like, oh yeah. And it's like, okay, I'm in the right class, but why is there 300 of the wrong people in here? And he just doesn't say anything. And then Dr. Packard goes, well, Tony, does that make sense to you? And then he's like, yeah, that's great, yeah. And then he writes another formula, right? And does that make sense to you? Yeah. He goes, okay, so that's wonderful. Could you explain to the rest of the class why time slows down at the bottom of a skyscraper? And he's like, and by now, we're all just laughing to death. And, you know, I probably didn't learn anything that day, but I had fun, okay? Because Dr. Packard valued fun, right? That was his value. And so it came out. And this is what values do, okay? So let me ask you one more question in this little exercise. I want you to think about a church or a religion that maybe you grew up with. And if you didn't grow up going to church or anything like that, I want you to think about one that maybe you were familiar with. If there was, maybe you had a friend that belonged to it or something. But I want you to think about that church or that religion or whatever that you participated in. And let me ask you kind of this same question again. What was the message you heard? What was the message you heard over and over and over again, right? I bet you were taught lots of things and you had long lists of theological things or whatever. But if I said, what's the one or two things that you heard over and over and over again, what was it? Was it, you better believe the right thing? Or was it, treat people kindly? Or was the message, it's all about money? Or was the message all about sin avoidance? Or was the message something about love? Like what was that message? It was interesting. I was talking to one of the members of our band right before this morning before you all got here, and we were kind of setting up and stuff. And he didn't even know what I was going to preach on. And he commented about something and talked about what he grew up in. And he said, you know, because he actually, I don't think he was going to church at all before he first started coming here. And he was invited to come and just help us out. And he said, I started, you know, participating. And next thing I know, I'm like, this is so different. And I want more of this. And he said, you know, growing up, the message I got was, you got to be careful because God is spiteful. God is spiteful. I was like, phew. And he said, and the other message I got was, do as I say, not as I do. Because that was just what I watched happen. And you understand, there were values behind that were driving that place to be the way it was. The things that maybe you're saying, man, the message I got over and over and over again at the church I grew up in or was a part of, it was the reason you got that message is because that was the value. They held that thing as being supremely important about life and how you live it. And it just shapes everything that comes out of it, see? So here's my first point in this. Values are powerful because values tend to bubble up and affect and push on everything. Values, and here's where they become a gift. Because if you have those values, they begin to guide you in a moment where you're like, I don't know what to do. I don't feel like I've ever run into this situation before. I'm at a relational crossroads with a friend, and how do I move forward with this friend? And we've never been at this spot before. You have some values that are true to you that can help guide you in moving through that. And to square up on those values will actually help you with whatever those things are that you face. And I want to give you an example of this from Jesus, because as I think about Jesus, he becomes a supreme example of someone who you see the values he lived. They just oozed out of him in so many situations. There's one of the stories I love about Jesus is after he calls Matthew, who would then become an apostle, he's like, Matthew, I want you to be one of my disciples. You're like, come and follow me. But Matthew was a tax collector. Tax collectors did not become disciples of rabbis. That was just unheard of, right? But Jesus does this, and he calls Matthew. And so they're kind of celebrating the day, that night, that Matthew becomes a disciple, because that would have been a really big deal in this culture. And so they throw a party. And who is Matthew going to invite, right? All of his synagogue buddies, like all the people that memorized the Old Testament. No, you know who he invited? Other tax collectors, because they were his friends. He's like, I'm going to call him up and get over here. That was a big deal in my life. Well, so now Jesus is over at Matthew's house, and what rabbis didn't do was hang out with a tax collector, let alone a whole room full of tax collectors in the middle of throwing a party that apparently started to spill out outside and into the street, where other people started to notice this happening. This is found in Matthew chapter 9. If you have your Bibles, feel free to turn to Matthew chapter 9. Here's what it says, starting in verse 10. It says, while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. They just keep on showing up. They're like, oh, Matthew's throwing a party. Well, I'm going to go over there. And they start showing up, right? When the Pharisees saw this, and they would be like these religious leaders of the day, right? When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, because Jesus has got a few other disciples, and they're probably going, what's Jesus up to as well? They're kind of hanging off to the side as well. This isn't necessarily their group either. The Pharisees saw this, and they asked the disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? In other words, why did he make this choice, right? He's setting kind of a bad example, right? He's I got a list of some rules and laws about what we're not supposed to do, and he's breaking a few of those right in this moment. Why? Why is your rabbi doing this in this moment, okay? And what you have to know is, Jesus had this bedrock of these values that helped him make decisions and shaped how he would live out his mission in this world, okay? And so I want you to notice Jesus' response in this moment. This is verse 12. On hearing this, Jesus hears him talking. On hearing this, Jesus said, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. And I love this, verse 13. But go and learn. Go figure this out. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. I am basking in hanging out with this group of people that are willing and wanting to come and hang out with me as a rabbi. Because here, you know what I value? You know what is at the bedrock of what shapes decisions and things I do? I want to be a bringer of mercy, not sacrifice. Jesus valued this. And so, in this moment, it's like, Matthew, you're going to bring some more of your friends? Sure. right? Because he valued this. It shapes this moment. He's just responding out of a clear understanding of what his values are. And they become powerful. That was a powerful moment. And Jesus sent this message about what his kingdom was to be about, what he's calling you and I to be about, and what being one of his followers is about. But it came because he had this kind of value in this. Okay, second thing about values, and it's this. Values don't change with the situation, okay? Values don't read a situation and then begin altering in some way. Rather, they're grounded through changing situations. In other words, values actually ground us to something when life is changing all around us. We may decide to live out a situation in multiple different ways, but how we choose to live it in different ways is because there's a grounding to a value that helps us understand how to live that situation out. But what we don't see are values that flop around based on the situation. Does that make sense in all of this? And this is why they become so valuable, because they tether us to something that's really helpful. I think about Jesus in this moment at Matthew's house. He could have responded in multiple different ways, and it's not like there was one right way for Jesus to respond in this, right? Jesus could have responded by saying, you know what, I'm setting a bad example. Because you know what Jesus wasn't trying to do? Jesus wasn't trying to highlight the moral integrity of tax collectors of his day, because this was a group that by and large were cheating and taking advantage of their own people, right? Hurting their own people for financial gain. That's whenever you read in the New Testament, and tax collectors kind of have a bad rap. And I get tax collectors nowadays may not have a great rap, but much different in Jesus's day, because they were literally cheating people out of their income. And Jesus isn't trying to lift that up as a value. And Jesus could have said, in this moment, I hear what you're saying. I don't want to send the wrong message. He could have done that. He could have said, this would be a moment to be more discreet. We'll pull the shades down on the window and we'll just have our party inside, and we won't advertise it out there. And what you realize is Jesus had this grounding to this value, right? About how people matter, about bringing mercy. And now he's using that value to shape what he would do in that moment. And he chooses in that moment, right, to hold that value in a way that is going to send this message about mercy. And so values help you navigate the decisions that you'll make. And let me say this as well. There's a difference between holding and believing in a value. You could believe in something that we would also call a value. For example, there's a passage that often gets called like the Imago Dei. It's in Genesis 1, and it's this basic idea that God created humanity in his own image. It is this beautiful idea that every human being, every person in this room reflects the image of God. Every one of you reflect the image of God. Every human being we walk outside and see reflects the image of God. Now, I can believe that, and do believe that, is a theological truth. Christians have believed that as a theological truth for 2 millennia, that across denominational lines. But there's a difference between believing that and holding it as a value. So for us as a church, we hold everyone being made in the image of God as a value. So that affects how we live. That affects the decisions that we make. It means when we look at someone, even if they disagree with us, even if that person would be against us, if I hold this value that that person is still made in the image of God, it will affect how I treat them. It will affect how I see them. If I hold it as a value, then it means I'm going to assume some things about them. I'm going to assume the best in them. I'm going to assume that there's something valuable in that person. I am going to assume and hold that they matter to God and therefore should matter to me and to you and to us as a church. So as a value, it starts affecting the decisions that we make and how we interact and who we're open to, and because everyone is made in the image of God. But we also know, right, that there have been churches and denominations throughout millennia that believe this, but have held people in ways that treat them like dirt, that hold people with a sense of inhumanity at times, that have treated them in deplorable ways, that things have been done in the name of the gospel that have hurt and killed and done great damage, because they could they could have a belief that is a theological thing, but didn't hold it as a value. And so my challenge to all of us is, as we identify values, we're to hold them, we're to lean into them. So that when we hold this idea of everyone is made in the image of God, that means there's going to be moments that's going to challenge us as a church. It means there's going to be moments where maybe there are divisive things out there. And what we're going to ask of ourselves is that we make space, even over divisive issues, to hold the community, to hold to seeing the best in someone, to assuming that there's something good about that person, that we, right? Do you see how that works? It shapes what you do. And I remember having that conversation late, early into the morning with this Christian leader over there, and I was walking through this, and he took this deep breath, and he was just like, yeah. And you could tell this is challenging for them, because he lives in a culture where there is real persecution, unlike what we face. They're less than 1% of the population. And we started talking about that because he has real stories where people in his church have been persecuted, have physically been beat up, have lost their livelihoods because they're a Christian, things that we don't face in this world in the same way. I remember talking to him about this. And I said, we hold this as a church. And he got this smile on his face, and he was like, this is what makes us different. I said, yes, this is what makes us different. This is the kind of thing that makes us all want to come together and would cause other people to want to become like us. I said, yeah, this is the power of a value, see? And so I say this, and you can tell I get passionate about this, right? This is the thing why values are so important. And I want you to know your values, because your values, we may have a lot of similarities, but I think God makes us, I think there are values that we would share, especially as a community, but I think God has made each of us different in unique ways. There will be things that you value that I don't value in the same way, that shape the decisions you will make in life. But isn't it a blessing that when you're faced with something difficult, to rest back and say, okay, this is who God has made me to be, and these are the values that I will keep leaning into, because they will shape the decisions I make about my career, about relationships, about financial things, about how I navigate through raising a family, or how I navigate this issue or that issue. They're really, really powerful. So, third point, because I don't want to take up too much time. Third point is this. You can't lean into your values if you can't name them, okay? I believe you have those values. In fact, I would even argue values are less chosen and more discovered, Okay, I think God gives us some freedom to choose some things about our values, but I think most of us will find that there are things that we value that are innate in us, that in some way God has wired them into who we are and what our being is. But if you can't name them, if you don't have your arms around them in a good way, I promise you, we live in a world where there is a myriad of voices that when you find yourself in a difficult situation and you feel like, man, I'm scrambling to figure this out. How do I handle this moment right now? We live in a world where there will be all these other voices screaming from different sets of values of what you need to do and how you need to respond in this moment. And you may very well end up making choices about how you parent, how you go through this situation, how you react to this or that don't really fit who you are. And you get through it, and there's this residue that you feel that you're just like, oh, I didn't like what did, and it bothers you. And maybe the reason is because you didn't have your arms around your value. And if you can't name them, it's hard to lean into them, right? So can I offer some really practical things here in this? Because I would love for you, if you don't already have a clear understanding what your values are, I would love for you to engage in a process of really discovering what those are. Here, I'm gonna throw up a list of values. This is a short list of values here, but I put down some values here just to give you an idea of what some of the values are. And if you have your phone right now, this would be one of those moments where the pastor rarely would say, hey, why don't you quit looking at me? And if you want to look at your phone right now, do that. And if you just Google values, or list of values, you'll get a list much longer than this. There's multiple places on there. But here's what I would say is, if you've never thought about this, just get a list of values, and it's readily available. There's a number of different authors or organizations that put out a list of values, and just start going through a list of values, 100 or so, and just start going, which ones pop out to you? And here's what I would say. Ultimately, if you can get it down to a tiny little number of values, and a lot of really good and smart leaders will say, get it down to 2, okay? I've not been able to do that personally, but I am still trying. But maybe here's where most people end up. Most people go through a list like that or a larger list, and they come up with 15 or 20. And they're like, oh yeah, these are my values. Here's the problem. If you have a list of 20 values, it's not that they become worthless, but they're not gonna be very valuable to you because it's too many to hold. If you can't name them and think about how they would operate in your life, the list is too big. So start with that list of 20, okay? But then as you go through it, start asking yourself some questions about okay, do I value, adventure, or do I value kindness more? Do I value, start narrowing it down. See if you can't get it, to 10 in there. And this is where you got to start praying then, right? Now you're going to say, okay, God, help me see, what are the truer, deeper values of that are really how you wired me to be, okay? And then you're going to get it down to that 10. And maybe as you get it down to that 10, start just observing yourself in moments where you come up to a decision or a way that you're interacting with people or something, and ask yourself, out of these 10 values, are there 4 or 5 that I actually see popping through more than the others in this? And begin trying to whittle that list down to just a few. And again, let me give you this piece of advice too. Don't pick the values you think you're supposed to have. Because it's really easy to go through a list of values and go, oh man, love and mercy seems so much more spiritual than adventure and risk-taking, okay? But if adventure and risk-taking is the truth of you, go with the truth of you. Trust God with this. And if God's like, yeah, I'm working on the mercy part of you. That's going to be a value in you someday. I'm still working. Then, let him do his work in you. But don't pick the values you think are the right answer, because at the end of the day, that won't help you, right? Get to the truth of what is you in this. It's interesting when you think about values and what they do is you begin to bring them down and understand, like, this is the truth of me. You will see how it will begin helping you move forward in ways you want to. If you've been at this church for 20 years, and I'm sure there are many of you that have been here 20 years, I'm sure there are many of you that are like, this is kind of my second time here. I was here for Christmas Eve and then today. If you've been here for 20 years, you would notice, there's probably a lot of things you would notice about how I've changed, okay? But one of the things, other than I have a lot more gray hair, I did not have gray hair 20 years ago, is that the emotionality that if you've been here a year, you're like, that Glenn guy, he can get going on something, tears start just flowing from him. He gets passionate and right? So 20 years ago, if you were here 20 years ago, I bet you never saw a tear out of my eyes. Just didn't happen. One of my values is centered around this thing of adventure and risk-taking, which sounds weird. Another one is courage, okay? And as I started drilling deeper and deeper into those values, it changed something about my preaching. So here's how I think of courage. For me, courage is the strength I derive from knowing what matters more than what I'm afraid of. Because I realized there were moments where there was a fear that I had. And I didn't even want to acknowledge that I had a fear about something. Well, like with leading a church, there's fears in that, or with life or whatever. But I realized there are things that matter to me more than what I'm afraid of, whether it's a relational fear, a financial fear, whatever it is. And when I can see clearly there's something that matters more than what I'm afraid of, it makes me strong. I find strength in being able to act despite my fears when I realize it. To me, that's courage. And one of the things that I realized was there are moments where I am trying so hard in my messages or in my sermons, and there's a moment where I was holding back on transparency or vulnerability in moments because I'm like, oh, man, I don't want to be that vulnerable. Like, what if they read that the wrong way, or what if that happens? And there'd be moments where I'm a passionate person, and like the emotion you see, it is genuine, but it was not coming out in my messages because there's a part of me that's just like holding back. But the more I got in touch with my values, the more I was like, but I'm passionate about this. And I would rather risk showing some emotion to express something that I think needs to be expressed than hold it back. And now I can't stop. Right? And that, y'all are very, very kind. That is just nothing more than I've turned a few values loose in me, and now it's just like I can't stop them, right? But I like what it does, right? There may be moments where I have tears and I'm just like, this feels awkward or whatever. But I look back on it and I'm like, but this is who God made me to be, and that's where I want to go. And I like how it's shaped the decisions that I've made. And there are moments, and this is not so much fun, but it's still a good thing. There are moments where I make a decision or go someplace and I go, ooh, that didn't feel good because that violated one of my values. And now I see it. And instead of ignoring it, or instead of beating myself up, I'm just like, I learned something. I made a choice that violated one of my values. And so now I want to make some different decisions. So I want to leave you with this, just simply. Do the work in this next year to figure out what are the values that God has ingrained into your heart and your soul, and then lean into them more and more and more, and let them shape you. Because when the next unexpected thing hits, those values, they will serve you well because it's how God made you. And you will have a better 2026 and 2027 and on and on and on. Well, I'm going to close this in prayer here. And before I do, may I just wish you all a very happy new year, invite you all back next year. And if you're a guest here this morning, it was an absolute delight to have you here. In fact, I'm going to be right over here. And and if you're new, I would love to welcome you this morning. Why don't you stand and let me close this with a blessing. May God just shine his face upon you and fill you with his peace and his love and his mercy. Amen. Have a great rest of your day.